Story 1. The snow twisted through the thick mists that rose off the water, creating a thick veil that obscured the distant island. The deep black of the sea quickly faded into the blinding neon grey of the sky, the light diffuse and scattering all shadow. The island itself flickered from view like a mirage, its hazy outline faint and indistinct. The boat struggled forward through the churning water, and slowly the jagged silhouette stabilized. The skinny, twisted trees blocked any view of the small settlement we'd come to find, but a long and crooked dock extended out into the hostile ocean. The unlikely storm stopped as soon as it had begun, white snowflakes replaced by raindrops for a brief moment before ceasing entirely. I didn't know it could snow this early up here, and I shivered in my thin jacket. Glenn steered the boat in, and I hopped over as soon as we were close enough, tying our boat to a post. I followed, shouldering my backpack and adjusting the straps, but I looked over at my mother's sudden indrawn breath. There was already a rope tied to the post we'd used, and she stepped closer to see what it was connected to. I followed her to the edge and looked down. The bow of a wooden boat was sticking up, a sharply curved beam that descended down into the murky, dark water. I looked down the dock and saw ropes tied off around most of the posts, at least a dozen. I walked to the next one and peered down, seeing another curved prow sticking upward through the black. Why? As soon as I started speaking, I stopped, startling myself with the crack that appeared in the silence. My mother came to stand next to me, and I heard the click of her camera. "We'll have to move the boat later so I can get some shots from the shore," she said, and began to move slowly down the dock, sighting through her lens. Glenn came over to stand next to me, rubbing his sparse beard. "Heck of a thing. You'd think they'd float." I had thought that until he said it, but now it seemed like a stupid thing to say. Boats sunk all the time, but all of them, all tied to the dock. Why? Again, I let my question die, this time unspoken, and followed my mother down the dock, careful to keep out of her viewfinder. A small area of packed dirt was clear ahead of us, with a path worn through leading up the hill and into the trees. I listened to the hollow thud of our footsteps, the soft shushing of the waves, and the faint click of my mother's camera. The sounds made barely a dent in the pressing silence. Where were the people? My mother had mentioned about 60 people lived in this settlement. I checked my phone, wondering if I had entirely lost track of time in the light that seemed to have barely faded before glimmering again across the perpetual cloud. It was barely 4 p.m. Surely there should be activity, especially considering all the boats were in. Had the people been stranded here? How long could they last alone? But the person my mother had spoken to had been here only a few days ago. Even if they had been stranded, that wasn't long enough for anything to go so wrong. And where was the snow? We'd been going through that storm for nearly half an hour. There was nothing. I turned in a circle. Nothing. My mother and Glenn were walking ahead now, sloping up the path, and I turned to follow them. My legs felt heavy as I walked, my steps dragging. With effort I caught up, but remained behind them so as not to obscure a potential shot. There was no one, no sound other than our steps, but the place still felt inhabited. I craned my head to look through the surrounding trees, but there was only the cool quiet. It wasn't too long before we reached a wider clearing where the land leveled out. "This must be the wrong place," I said. I sighed and regretted it instantly, the rotten seaweed scent of the ocean still thick in the air. Glenn shook his head. "This is where he said to go, the crooked dock. The only other dock on the island is the short one on the other side. We couldn't have circled the entire island by accident." "Right," I said, gesturing to the open meadow we stood in. He shook his head stubbornly. "The other dock only has space for 3 boats, that's what he said. We'd know." "Then it's the wrong island." My mother interrupted our bickering. "It's the right place. I recognize it from the photos Johnny sent. It wasn't that I didn't believe her, but it couldn't be true. I got out my phone and pulled up the pictures she'd forwarded me from Johnny, her contact at the nearby bird sanctuary. There'd been at least one including a view of part of the village with its sturdy wooden houses on high stilts to keep them accessible when the winter snows came. I held up my phone, walked a bit further in, and lined up the view. A crooked tree bent near a grey rock that jutted out of the dirt, just like in the photo. Though in the photo, a house partially obscured the tree. How? Again, the question died before it could be formed. I didn't even know what to ask. How? What? Who? It was hard to know where to start when questioning the impossible, just a waste of words. "Let's look around," my mother said, and started deeper into the clearing. I watched her for a bit before looking back at the trees. What was there to see? I walked around the perimeter of the clearing and, not finding anything, went further into the trees. The smell of the ocean remained thick and heavy in the air, completely overwhelming any scent of pine or earth. After a bit, I sat down on a fallen tree and brought up the photos my mother had sent before we left. They weren't great, blurry, and taken with an old phone, I guessed. Johnny had stopped by the island when he'd heard something about a strange catch they'd brought up. He'd sent a photo of a grinning man, one of the fishermen maybe, with the edge of a house and the weird tree off to the side. All of the photos had a strange effect on them that made me think not only was the photographer unskilled and the camera old, but also the lens must be covered in some kind of oil. The photo of the creature was even worse than the others, showing a shimmery blur around a huge bent thing. It almost seemed like a fissure in the ground rather than a material being, the way it splayed across the dirt, its soft body at rigid angles. The darkness of it was near absolute, though likely that was due to the blur erasing any detail. A sound cut through my study, and I jerked my head upright. I couldn't see either my mother or Glenn, but it didn't sound like someone walking. It was more like a creaking, low and throaty. As I looked slowly around, I felt the fine hairs on my body rise. The forest had a strange, hazy radiance to it in the bright, diffuse light. I felt almost like I was on a movie set, the way the shadows didn't seem quite right, the directionless brilliance. The sound came again, a low and deep noise that shuddered through the air. I started to look up, toward the direction it came from, when a loud crash had me scrambling backward. A giant branch lay across the ground in front of me, a large peeling gash where it would have connected to the tree. My heart thudded as I stared at the long wound along the side of the tree. Now that I was paying attention, looking up instead of down, it seemed to me the tree limbs bent down strangely, almost as if straining against a heavy weight. Another crash cut through the quiet, though much further away. Silence fell again, but it felt more fragile now, knowing how easy it was to shatter. I headed back to the clearing and noted how many fallen branches I passed. The earth below was nearly invisible beneath the cover of pine needles, bits of scrub, and broken tree limbs. I didn't feel well. When I got back to the open area that had once housed a village, Glenn stood there, still and staring upward at the sky. He didn't stir at my presence and only finally looked over when I called his name. "What are you doing?" I asked, though the answer seemed self-evident. "There's no birds," he replied, and looked back to the sky. "So?" I shrugged, feeling the weight of my backpack pulling my shoulders down. "We're pretty far from the mainland." Glenn finally met my eyes, though only to be sure I saw him roll his. "Yeah, Birgit, but we're not that far from the bird sanctuary. There's almost 500,000 birds around there, so you'd think we'd see one or two." I shrugged again, barely managing to stop myself from jumping when I heard another distant crash. Before I could start to worry, I saw Mother striding through the trees. "Birgit, you need to go back and tell Kendall something is going on here. Stay with Marie and have him come back," she said, not even looking at me, her attention focused on the photos in her viewfinder. "Can't we just radio them?" I asked, knowing Kendall had warned us about the weak cell coverage out here. He'd given us a radio when we'd gotten the boat. "It isn't working." She pulled the handset from her bag, pressing the button. A rough, staticky noise blared, accompanied by a high-pitched warble. "Take the radio too, tell him to bring another." "Send Glenn," I protested. "I need his help to set up the equipment," she replied, already unzipping one of the duffel bags she'd brought. I could see this wasn't up for debate, it was an order, but what exactly was she going to photograph? An empty field, maybe some kind of proof of what happened here, but what had happened here? I looked back as I walked down the path and saw, instead of setting up her gear in the field, she seemed to be aiming it at the trees. She gestured to the ground while Glenn unzipped the other bag. When I reached the packed dirt clearing by the dock, I dropped my backpack and felt an instant sense of relief. I must have overpacked it again. I rubbed at my sore shoulders. I wouldn't need it anymore, and carrying it any further felt exhausting. I didn't notice at first, but the dock was so close to the water that I could see the water level had risen slightly in the hour we'd been on the island. The tide must be coming in, and a few small puddles had formed on the old wood. I jumped back into the boat and held the key until the motor caught. Steering carefully, I made sure not to hit the sunken boats that lingered beneath the water. It wasn't until I was speeding away that I checked the compass bearing. It spun uselessly, and I banged it against my leg before checking it again. I locked the wheel, opened the side compartment, and looked to see if we had a spare. Right now, I could orient on the island, but it was already vanishing behind me. The mist was thick across the water, the boat cutting through fog almost as dense as the sea below. The island was quickly turning into a wobbling mirage. Though I hadn't throttled up, the boat seemed to move faster through the waves. I checked the compass again. This time, the needle pointed straight and true. I relaxed. I didn't want to have to tell Mother I'd failed at such a simple task. It was nearly 3 hours later when I returned to the island. I was grateful for the near-endless daylight of late summer this far north. I'd told Marie and Kendall what I could, though neither of them seemed to believe me. Kendall made it clear he thought we were in the wrong place, and Marie insisted I eat, as if that would put my head on straight. I should have taken my own photos. If it was so hard for me to believe when I saw things with my own eyes, why would they? I didn't mention that Mother had asked Kendall to replace me. I wasn't going to sit at the cabin doing nothing, even if it was a reprieve from Glenn's company, and I needed Mother to know I wasn't useless. The air whipped past as the island materialized from the grey mists. The sky still cloaked everything in liquid brilliance, the sunlight scattered by the infinite water droplets in the clouds and air. I felt blinded by the milky light and relieved to finally have contrast to focus on. I slowed the boat a good distance away, trying to line up with the dock I knew would be cutting into the sea. I heard the caw of birds and, remembering Glenn's words, looked up to see a dark line of them flying northwest past the island. As they neared, they parted, sliding through the air like a current diverted, splitting into two arcs that curved past the island before meeting again on the other side. I looked back to the dirt clearing barely visible ahead. The dock was lower now, so low that I could only notice it from the posts still jutting up from the sea. I wasn't sure why the villagers built their dock so close to the water, when they must have known the tide would make it difficult to access. I decided to avoid the dock and the sunken boats entirely and motored up to the edge of the water. When the boat nudged against the mud, I jumped out and tied the rope to a tree growing along the tide line. My backpack wasn't where I'd left it. Glenn or Mother had probably taken it. Maybe not the best way to show Mother how responsible I am. I double-checked that I had both radios Kendall had given me and began trudging back up the road. The long day, filled with hours following the river from Inuvik to the cabin, and then more hours on the ocean, was catching up with me. The slope that had felt gentle before now seemed steep as I dragged myself up to the clearing. They weren't there. Mother was not the type of person to wait patiently. I looked around for any sign of where they might be, but only the silence answered me. That brittle, suffocating silence. I waited, alternating between exploring the nearby forest and sitting in the clearing for nearly an hour before giving up. Glenn had mentioned another dock. That was the only other place to go. They'd probably cut through the trees, but I could just take the boat. I circled the island twice, still not finding the other dock. It occurred to me that this dock might also be below the tidewater, so I searched for any sign of an opening. Finally, I spotted a wider gap in the forest. I slowly motored in and tied off to a nearby tree. My feet squelched uncomfortably in my supposedly waterproof boots as I walked up the thin path that wove through the pines. I tried calling out, but my voice was as thin as the distant sound of the waves. I stood again in front of a clearing, no houses or people to greet me. Mother and Glenn were nowhere to be seen, nor the bags of equipment. But this clearing wasn't as empty as the other. A small pile of what seemed to be dirt and possibly branches lay in the middle, with no explanation for why or what purpose it served. A long, low sound echoed through the air, reminding me of the tree that had sundered earlier. But this sound was lower, deeper. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable. I moved closer to the pile of dirt and was immediately hit by the harsh, sea-scented air. The pile was bigger than I had thought, casting a long shadow behind it, and then the shadow moved. I tried to stumble back, but my feet were stuck. I looked down in uncomprehending panic at the dirt rising nearly to my shins. The shadow twitched again, and the light pressed down on me, that murky sunlight a weight enough to crush me. A sound, higher now, keening, came from somewhere. It was me, but how could it be? My body responded with animal whimpers, while my mind struggled to understand. The rain began, each drop a sharp stone, hammering my body. I heard a rumbling, barely audible, deep and vibrating through my bones. A thunderous storm seemed to emanate from the dark thing before me. A rainbow shimmered across the edge of my vision as water, light and air bent around me. The world bent, and then broke. Story 2. Descending into an evening like this one, I could not just saunter away, but in the delirium of that startling cold, past the twigs fashioned by the frozen breath of winter and the freezing heat which derived from each breath taken, could only put a halt to my trotting legs and give in to the fiery spectacle of that evening, where light danced all across the air, and the laughter never seemed to want to put a stop to the demands of the heart. The human spirit, possessed by the gaiety and gladness of life, had taken hold, bashing away the many undesired and despicable aspects of the intellectual mind of the men, and each of the inhabitants of the town had taken in their account to be as merry and jolly as their miserable witnessing eyes could let them be. Yet somewhere inside the wall of the university, hidden from all eyes, lay a horrid scene. Away from the choking crowd celebrating down the streets, through the mildew which grew rapidly onto the cold, naked floors and walls which were hidden from the natural light by the high vaulted ceiling and held captive no hidden soul, a mark in the trajectory of its history was taking place. And only I was about to be the singular spectator of such a chilling scene. The long, haphazard hallway, which led to the unfathomably cold seminar rooms and lecture halls where the students took futile refuge from harsh winter's nights, had emptied itself of any human presence, and it was, not as oddly for that time of the nocturnal darkness, as deadly cold as a graveyard in the mid-time of the fleeting night. The door was knocked thrice, with a frantic echo each time, and each hesitantly halted. With great pause in between one another, and with mild uncertainty, when no one ushered a sound, I sidled in cautiously. The strong stench of foul alcohol struck me instantly in the nose. Mixed with a distant putrid vinegar scent, the death whiff had taken hold of the whole room plan and had spread its dank wings in each corner of the ivy-covered grey walls, whose colour was hardly noticeable. Other smells dwelled in there, such as an oddly vivid, grassy or lemony scent, A cinnamon perfume from who knows where, since I knew the owner of the room hadn't ever had a particular liking to its nauseating aroma. A hint of rotten eggs could be detected, and the amplified smell of benzene, which was of a bilious attack to my senses. A strong smell which I had not encountered before made my stomach churl even further. The aroma of the wet books left on the table and all along the shelves had a significant smell too, yet it could only be traced if you went as far as almost 2 paces away and tried really hard to smell them, as otherwise their smell could easily be cancelled out by the pungent fragrance of the few sets of garlic set upon the table loosely, and the fishy smell nearby, which was more concentrated than in any other part of the quarter. A few seconds in, and my head had begun to ring at once. The dorm was hardly worth setting your eyes upon, something I had already very clearly anticipated. Few flowers, standing coyly at the edge of the ledge of the window, had begun to wither more than necessary, having left already some of its dry petals spread around the vase. The windows tightly shut made a creaking wreckage of a noise from the hostile wind, which had picked up since that afternoon trying to judder it open. I saw that some of the food placed on top of the counter had already grown mouldy. The air was stifling. Everything in that compact room held a disfavoring air of rottenness. As I went to fetch the bin, which was inhabited by all sorts of webs and dead insects, close to the small dusty couch, I noticed that small lumps of mold had invaded most of the wall there for quite some time, something which even I was informed about. None of it was really as indubitably as one might experience them in this situation, yet I couldn't help but wonder how well it would have been if the mold wouldn't have formed. But as much as I wanted the mark gone, none of my wishful thinking could really cease that paint over the wall. The room had turned into this sad version of itself, and I was in a quandary. Faced with this situation, I began doubting my ability to stay tranquil. I couldn't be surprised at such a villainous state of the room, nor could I utter that I had not foreseen such a turn of events. How the malevolent spirit of the room had now arrived at its peak, and how I wished I was back at my own place, in that clean haven of the most virtuous conditions of purity. How I wished, instead of having met the principal that damned morning, I had done the other way, and had passed through the cobblestone path which directed with ease each foot toward the garden of tranquility. Instead, I had taken the road of gloom, and had crossed paths with the old man of few words, though that day he led no words unspoken nor unsaid, and had such a conversation with him as if we had been colleagues of another life. That cursed old man had even gone so far as to shake my hands with his own withering and bony one, and at such length had he held them intact, I had begun to feel a stiffness, as if his illness of decrepitude was emitting through the veins and was climbing into my youthful and passionate heart. Such a revolting experience had been in my part, that I had almost felt our blood cells link. It had taken all I had got in my soul and spirit not to shamelessly jerk my hand free from the old man's flaky fingers, and not to stride away from him. That despicable man had given me a task of such severity. I had stood appalled in front of the old geezer, and it had taken me a few seconds before I had finally agreed, while yanking the man's hand even harder toward his equilibrium. As I had parted ways with him, the choices I had made seconds ago started to finally regain consciousness, and I had almost taken a toll right there on the front had it not been for some passing students walking down the hall. That morning, the sky had been clear, and the chill of the hazy morning had been most vacant. But as the day had progressed, that very chill had managed to somehow make itself present in each room, lobby, and in each devious crank of the wall. As the archaic university held inside some of the most prominent figures of that time, it also held the same amount of hollow souls you could ever imagine. Where the towers of gleam drew height, the detached attitude of the residents struck down, and such I was inhibited not to make a fuss when men walked the path with such little agility that they seemed like corpses, not humans, walking through those school grounds. The mood of that morning weather had been so perfectly balanced to their customs, and while the sweetness in the air had rapidly dissipated, the students had taken a rather unpromising approach to this change, and had gone to celebrate nevertheless to the town's boulevard. All day had I been haunted by this task that my professor had given me, a task such unfitting for my attitude and revolting of pride. All day and each minute I had spent in agony, and had not been able to achieve anything desirable during the moments of my domineering piece of labor. Having finished all my classes, and when the school ground had left little to no students or staff members, I had slowly made my way along the hall where I had not stepped in a long time. I walked across the familiar routes toward the room of mortal doom. My inability to remain calm and this terrorizing attitude toward one simple task, such as this, came from a place of self-benevolence. This sickening natured feeling such interaction summoned in me, and which was about to take place, had been something which had not inhabited my heart up until a few weeks ago, and it all had been for the fault of my ill-natured friend. This piece of work held into his soul something I had not been able to see before, something dark and sinister. For a long time we had been friends, yet because of an accident, things had been fiddly between us. Rather than an accident, it had been something of an accidental discovery, a truth which the other party had mistakenly let slip out. I was still unsure if the other one had taken knowledge of me discovering this tragic truth, but I had not wasted much time in ruling out the possibility of him knowing that I possessed such information. Slowly I had begun to detach myself from him, in fear he would have spotted this change of heart on like a blood-sniffing dog I now saw him to be. My hovering heart had taken a calmer attitude since that day, but could not shake this dreading feeling in me. One thing was for sure. When I had entered the dark, tiny room behind the flamboyant fake shelf in his room, the darkness of that room had made it difficult for me to distinguish what object that room held inside, which is why it might have been the light or the gassy smell which had made me think that instead of something else, I had seen the jar of severed fingers. The terror had taken such a strong hold of my body that I hadn't been aware of the startling voice of my friend that had called me from outside the room. That boy of short stature and bony body had been standing just outside the room. Then I had descended from the room, barely breathing in horror, yet I had been able to preserve my panic to the best of my abilities, and so I had been fairly sure my friend hadn't seen me emerge from his room, which I had walked into unwittingly. And as all my effort had been for nothing, and as I had let myself steer through the corridor, my bones had felt nothing but raw terror. But despite all that nightmarish confluence, when I had finally ventured into the room, all my visceral compulsion and unbridled emotion had been completely supplanted by the pernicious odor of the room, and for a rapid second, at juncture of such severe shift of sentiment, I had found myself to feel somewhat consoled amidst all these frequent influences. At the sight of the empty room, I had been quick, rather impetuous, and engulfed by my solitary state, to avert my eyes to the big shelf standing so ominous under the huge crystal chandelier. So forsaken I felt at the moment, perching there on my own heart in my hand and only my shadow as my companion. I felt the rush of my testy blood, and before I could govern this chancy agitation, I had begun to march toward this vile woodpile and had almost immediately stopped myself as if my heart had pulsated, as if to signal me not to take my pursuit further. So easy it would have been for me to mold each word to my liking and simply run to my professor and reassure my heart with all kinds of fabrication, to tell him all he wanted to hear and then leave and have nothing to do with any of these grotesque arrays any longer. But these sequences of thought only made my resolve stronger. Why should I feel weakened by these revolting, insufficient attempts of my old friend? We had been friends for the longest period, damn it. As if I could be frightened by such abhorrent ways. Cursing under my breath with a shaky voice, I began to take steps further. The shelf once again had come undone and was unlocked just a bit, so there I would fit myself swiftly without as much ordain as I had imagined. My shirt got caught in one of the nails which had come spiraling out of his place, but I paid no mind to it, as it was but a small slit. And as I went in, immediately I was baffled by the horrendous scene. The previous room had been so full of chemicals and intangible reeks, I had failed to animate the strongest stench of all among the other smells, the one of one singular rotting organism. The room among the rotten smell had the most distinctive sour smell of mouldy wood, and the steps I took on those thin planks cracked distinctly and crispy. The room was poorly dimmed, and some old lamps were placed at the entry and illuminated the chamber, giving it a strange, dreadly nuance. The dull light gave the room a contrived and more secluded appearance. Straight away, I noticed all sorts of containers, sealed jars, flasks with what seemed to be liquid on closer inspection, tubes which connect them with one another, all of them placed on top of the main counter. The room resembled the structure of a small laboratory, if not to say it was that specifically. All of them were full of placid liquid, with bubbles trapped above the liquid, and there laid what seemed to be embalmed fingers and toes. I saw them first above everything else, and I realized what I had witnessed those past weeks had been just that. These were the horrors closer to me, and as I advanced further down to the cabinets arranged above and the rack along it, I saw bones mounted in armature, hung height in the wall as frames all across that corner of the dark chamber. Further from the light in one of the other corners was a miniature shelf with glass covers, and there placed in bigger jars were all sorts of rodents. One of them was even in the previous table, as I recalled, because in the moment of fright I had not been able to recognize it before, and as I looked again the rodent was butchered all through his stomach, and as it laid wide open no blood was apparent. My blood drained from my face at the thought of someone having done such macabre work, deriving all its blood away in ways I could not even begin to think. Its insides were almost arid of moisture, and all its content was gone except for the heart and the lungs, which were still unscathed. And all of this work was done so shoddy and had given barely mediocre efforts, and not to mention the unprofessional conditions of such an underground lab, was that the result of whatever the doer had wanted to achieve had been completely useless. My muscles were now all soggy, having witnessed such a bone-chilling scene of crime. All I could do was look around the room and take all of it in. Finally, my legs gave out, and I fell backward. The ground was solid and hard, but where my hand had landed, I felt something soundless squishing along with something that felt a little spiky. As my hand at once recoiled in such terror, I mumbled a mute scream. The flinch caused by the blood-curdling sensation I had felt left me frozen in place before tuning to see what had brushed my hands. At my continuous horror, when I spun, what I saw was so alarming I almost gave in to fainting. A body in the most unnatural stance lay there unmoving. A corpse, the face of which was of my friend, and now stood eye-open looking at the void in front of him. Who could have done such a thing? All this time I had blamed my friend for the treacherous crime I had witnessed, not taking into account it could have been someone else. What if someone had threatened my dear friend, and instead of helping, had left him in his mercy, all alone? I placed my hand in my mouth in horror and let out a low cry of fear, and backed up and met the other side of the chamber, as it was quite small, and once again at the sensation I retracted immediately, feeling something wet touch my outer garment. But that had done it. I was to leave this place, get help, and never set foot inside there, so maybe my friend's soul could rest in peace instead of such a disturbing place. But as I was backing away, my leg tangled somewhere, and once again I lay on the grounds. What had made me fall was a small wooden plank and letter attached to it. All it read were a few small words, but quite disturbing. "Farewell, my friend. Do not be scared. They will help you, as they generously did with me." And suddenly my sight went to the body of my friend. Petrified, I saw what I had not seen before. One eye socket was empty, one of his arms severed, and all his fingers gone. And suddenly, a chilling, gentle breeze touched my skin, the breath of an ominous entity. Story 3. I stood by the window and stared out over the lake. There was a storm brewing, one for the record books if the radio hadn't been exaggerating. The greyness outside matched my mood, but this was not what I needed right now. With a heavy sigh, I turned away from those depressingly dark clouds and picked up my paints. The only thing I could do now was to pray that the electricity would hold up against the storm so I could finish my painting. I had to finish it. Not because of any pressing deadline, but for my own sanity. That damned painting kept calling for me, beckoning me to keep going, and I knew from experience that the tug wouldn't go away until the piece was finished and hanging in the gallery with the others. Dave's old digital camera was already up and running, a precaution I had put in place after losing consciousness or falling into a trance when painting the last two paintings. The feeling of not knowing how or why the paintings turned down twisted paths had been too difficult for me. I had to know about every brush stroke that went into the piece, not just waking up and seeing the changes. Not that the knowledge had eased my mind one bit, it just made things worse. I had always been a talented painter who excelled in nature paintings. They were my bread and butter. Art critics even went as far as to describe them as windows into the real world. Looking at them could give you a sense of really being there, every painting so bright and cheerful, until they weren't. It had happened 2 times now, not counting the one I was working on. The first one had started out perfect. Bright blue sky with puffy clouds over a forest clearing straight out of a fairy tale. I even had a buyer in mind after the first painting session. But after a brief nap, I woke up to a different painting. The sky was darker, the trees were tangled up, and in the foreground, there was suddenly a campfire where I had planned to put some flowers. I couldn't remember making any of those changes. For a moment, I thought that someone had broken in, but why would they have messed with my painting? All windows and doors were locked, so the most logical conclusion was that I had somehow done it myself, and that was just as scary of a thought. Fully intent on changing it back, I grabbed some paint and brushes. It shouldn't be all that hard to fix, just lighten the sky back up with some pale blue, lighter green color for the trees. I even had a vague plan to use the campfire for a cozy camping scene. To my distress, none of that happened. I could clearly remember sitting down, lifting the brush, and then nothing. It was like I blinked and found myself standing in front of the easel, a truly horrible experience. The scene on the canvas had grown even darker. It was clearly closer to dusk now. The trees were woven in and out of shadows, and the campfire was so bright that it could just as well have been real. As I leaned closer, I saw a dark orange tent a bit further in the back, with its opening positioned towards the viewer. I felt completely exhausted, like I had been painting a part of my own soul into it. In a way that I had never done before, I felt like I was losing my mind. It was my friend Dave that gave me a possible solution. "Babe, just put up a camera wherever you are painting. Shouldn't matter if you are doing it at home or in the gallery. I have one that you can borrow. If this memory lapse thing happens again, you just watch the recording and all your questions will be answered." Just like him to think up an easy solution on the fly. He gave me the camera and I positioned it the same evening, which had been a blessing because in the morning the painting was complete. Apparently, I had worked on it feverishly for 5 hours without knowing, which was another blow to my sanity. Who paints for 5 hours without knowing about it? And the painting. It was like no other I had ever painted before. It was so intense. The fire burned brightly, so brightly that you could see it dance around the wood. It didn't take much of imagination to really feel the heat and smell the smoke that wafted up into the sky. The tent wasn't empty anymore. You could see the silhouettes of 2 persons lying in there. The painting could almost pass as peaceful in an eerie kind of way, but looking closer you started to see little licking flames spreading in a thin line from the campfire over to the tent. I had felt like I was watching an accident happening in slow motion, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had seriously thought about destroying it, but Dave stopped me. "And this is a masterpiece. Even I can see that. Just hang it up in the gallery, and someone will give you a pile of money for it. I would stake my life on it, And well, if not, you can give it to me. That damned painting was now hanging in the darkest corner of the gallery, waiting for someone to want it. Poor Dave wouldn't be saving me from it. He had gone camping. Feeling inspired to find this mysterious place and see it for himself, he went with a group of his buddies. They all got drunk, didn't think about anything as basic as fire safety, and almost burned the whole forest down along with themselves. Just like what seemed to be happening with the painting. The booming sounds of thunder close by brought me back to myself. The stiffness in my hand was a telltale sign that it had happened again. Although for the first time I hadn't fallen into a trance as much as gotten lost in my memories. A quick glance at the canvas confirmed it. No need to check the camera this time. The painting was turning out just like the last two. Colourful intentions that got twisted into something more sinister and foreboding. I gently rolled my shoulders and arched my back to ease some of the tension from sitting too long, and really looked at what I had been painting. The once serene cabin by the lake moment I had been trying to capture was starting to reflect the reality of the moment. A massive storm was clearly brewing overhead, and distant flashes of lightning could be seen far in the background. I could only hope that this was as bad as it would get. A beautiful picture of horrible weather that, in the real world, would blow over in a couple of hours. That would be it. If anything, I was owed a bit of luck after everything those paintings had put me through. A strange feeling of dissociation washed over me, and I could feel myself slipping away again. This time, Susan dominated my thoughts. My best friend and the second cursed painting that ruined what I had left of my old self. It was a beautiful water scene requested by a new client. The subject was an old lake, located in the middle of a small town 2 hours away. That lake was the pride and joy of the townspeople who had made a whole tourism industry around it. In the summer, people could come and rent colourful boats to sail in, and over the winter months, when the lake had frozen over, they would host ice skating competitions. My client wanted it painted in full summer glory, so I would need to go there as soon as possible to get a feel for it myself. Susan had demanded to accompany me. "There's no way that I'm letting you drive over there by yourself. You would get hopelessly lost. You are beyond horrible with directions." I had just laughed and accepted the offer. It was a perfect opportunity for us to spend a little time together. This whole thing was supposed to be so easy. Some rough sketching on site and lots of pictures from all possible angles for reference later on. Susan even offered to cover the pictures so I could focus entirely on the sketches. Susan had helped before, so I knew that she would get me everything I could possibly need. The trip had been lovely, and the first painting session at home had been such a joy. Every stroke of the brush fell perfectly in place. 2 days later, I woke up on the couch feeling exhausted, with dry paint all over my hands. Oh God, no. Panicked, I jumped up, ran over to the easel, and forced myself to look closely at the painting, to really take in every last detail of it. The overall feeling of happiness was still in it, but there was something off about it. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. A small red boat was now sailing in the middle of the lake, with a petite woman sitting in it, with her back facing forwards. Something shimmering deep down in the water had caught the woman's attention, so she was leaning over the side for a closer look. I instantly relaxed. There wasn't anything bad in there. Only a new character that made it even better and more personal. Excitedly, I worked on the painting for the rest of the day, and by the evening it was finished. My client would love it. It was everything I had been asked for, and then a little bit more. The only thing left was for it to dry properly, and it would be ready for its new owner. A few days later, I wrapped it up and sent it to the client, only to have it quickly returned. "This is not what we agreed on. Why on earth would you send me something like this?" Thoroughly confused, I opened it up in the gallery and felt my heart sink. This was not the painting I had finished, although looking back over the recordings, I could see all the alterations happening. The haunting feeling from the campsite painting had manifested in this one as well. The sky was a darker shade of blue, closer to fall than summer. Out on the lake, the boat was starting to tilt dangerously to the side. The woman was barely keeping her balance, gazing into the water. The shimmer from below was more golden, more beckoning, luring her in. And if that wasn't bad enough, a pale, skeleton-thin hand was rising up from the waves, clasping onto the boat as if trying to capsize it. Just looking at it made me sick to my stomach. And when Susan drowned in that same lake a month later, I nearly lost my sanity completely. A mixture of pain and intense sorrow had me blinking. Slowly looking down, I saw that the paintbrush had broken apart in my hand, stabbing through the flesh. The minutes ticked by as I just sat there in a haze, watching the blood pool in my palm, forming small streams that dripped down into my lap. Those damned haunted paintings had cost me 2 dear friends and a whole year of being unable to pick up anything close to drawing or painting. A whole year of creating nothing, just staring at the blank canvas, deadly afraid of manifesting some horror that would strip me of more friends or even my family members. And then out of the blue, I had been scrolling on the internet and seen a picture of this cabin. A random ad that stuck with me. A picture forming deep in my psyche, demanding to be made real. The need to paint was so strong and urgent that I had booked the cabin, bought all the supplies needed, and even packed up the car without a second thought. It was only after parking in the driveway that my common sense and the dread had returned. But that was a little too late. There was no turning back now. That tug I felt, the need to finish what my mind had already started, wouldn't be denied. Even the fleeting thought of quickly sketching and then returning home to do the actual work had been instantly dismissed. Outside the cabin, the storm seemed to be reaching its climax. Each gust of wind sounded stronger than the last one. The lights flickered, and that finally pushed me to stand up, bandage my wounded hand, and find some candles. It wouldn't really help me to be stuck here in the dark. It wasn't until I returned to the living room that I finally noticed the calm. My mind was suddenly at ease. There was no tug, no need to keep going. Just peace. Something I hadn't felt since before Dave died. Before I had seen that damned clearing in the woods and wanted to see how it would come out on the canvas. Whatever had taken hold of me was gone. In that wonderful moment of relief, the power went out. The only illuminations came from a single candle and flashes from the lightning that danced around outside. What did I paint? Do I want to see it? I have to see it. I grasped the candle and brought it slowly with me over to the painting. Only a small peek at it, and then I'll go and liven this place up with more candles. I might even try to light the fireplace. I would make a cozy night of it. Drink that bottle of wine I had mindlessly brought with me. I could celebrate that newfound calm and freedom. The painting was dark, just as stormy as it was outside. My little cabin was illuminated by dozens of lightning strikes, all too close for comfort. I could see the flicker of a candle through one of the tiny windows, and peering closer, I saw the silhouette of the person holding it. For a moment I had the uncanny feeling of looking through a window. I could feel a hint of the wind blowing on my face. The lightning was glowing, and the biggest of them came down from the sky and struck a tree right beside the cabin. I watched as the trunk seemed to shatter from the impact in real time. The tree started to fall down ever so slowly, pulled down by gravity. Story 4. When I wake up, the fog is still there. Thicker than when I arrived yesterday. The inside of my mouth is pasty and it tastes metallic like blood. I run my tongue around but find no wounds, feel no pain. My face and hair are wet. The coat I've used as a blanket is covered in fine droplets. I raise myself off the hard bench and stretch. It's not cold out here, but a chill courses through me. The air is still. No sounds of life. No one else on the street, though any number of people could be hidden in the banks of fog surrounding me. I turn away from the street and face the water. I can't see or hear it, but I sense it's there. A large body of water, deep and cold. There are footfalls somewhere off to my right. Hard-sole shoes on pavement, followed by the bright tinkle of a bell. I stuff the coat in my duffel bag and head toward the sounds. Hi there. When I was here yesterday, your colleague told me there might be a ferry running today. The old man behind the counter looks up from a crossword puzzle and shakes his head. That's not possible, son. Right. He did say the fog was too thick yesterday, and I know it's still pretty bad today, but I'm not talking about the fog, although looking at it now, I wouldn't go out in these conditions. Can't see past your own nose out there. But I mean, you couldn't have talked to someone else here yesterday. I'm the only ferryman on this side. Wait, no, it was you. I asked if the ferry was running and you said the fog was too heavy. You said maybe tomorrow. Don't you remember? He returns to his crossword. No offense, but no, I do not. But I remember you. Your name is Lou, and you seem to be a little mixed up, son. That ain't me. He taps the breast pocket of his overalls, where blood-red embroidered letters spell B-U-B. I linger on the name, then study his face. Did Lou have that same cleft in his chin? Bub's eyes are dark, were Lou's green. I can't get a firm grasp of any details and look around to reorient myself. Outside the office window, nothing moves, not even the fog. Okay, Bub, whatever you say, but we're both here today. So, when is the ferry leaving? He peers out toward the water, then back at me. I don't think we can help you today. Fog's too thick. Can hardly see past your own nose out there. Yes, that's what you said yesterday. Already told you it wasn't me. I'm the only ferryman on this side, and there's no chance I could forget a stranger like you. Did he just smirk at me? Is this some kind of game they play with outsiders here? Please, mister, it's urgent. Don't these ferries have equipment on board, sensors or something, to navigate in these conditions? He scoffs. You youngsters think technology is the solution to everything, eh? No, I just assumed that since you're the ferryman, you'd be able to, ferry me to the other side. Call me crazy. I don't take kindly to sarcasm, son, and you assumed wrong. Won't be any trips made today. He turns his attention back to the crossword. Maybe tomorrow. But I need to go today. Bub sighs heavily and puts down his pencil. Do you even have a valid ticket? What? Number. But I'll buy one right now if it helps get me out of here. I don't sell the tickets. I operate the ferry for any passenger with a valid ticket. Fine. Where do I get the ticket? Beats me. You're serious? He shrugs, and after several more seconds of silence, it becomes clear there will be no further response. Okay then. I'll buy one from the website or something. Can you just tell me when the next ferry leaves? Soon as this fog clears. But when will that be? It's been nothing but fog since I got here. And when was that? He asks. It was yesterday, I think. Yeah, must have been. How did you arrive here, son? I open my mouth to form an answer, then pause. My brain is still clouded by deep sleep. Wait, it was dark out and there was no one around, so I bedded down in that bus shelter over there. I point outside. Was I on a bus? Bub raises his eyebrows in amusement. Are you asking me how you got here? No, can you just tell me how to get to the other side? That'd be the ferry, he says, keeping a straight face. Runs every day. Of course it does, but not today, because of the fog. He squints at where the shoreline would be. Yes, now that you mention it, I can't take you today. Not with all this fog. You can hardly see past your own nose out there, I reply, and he nods gravely. But maybe tomorrow. To be honest, the fog tends to linger this time of year. Might last for days, weeks even. Weeks? Could be months. Matter of fact, it's hard to recall the last day we had without this fog. What is this? Fog season? I guess you could say that. But the ferry has to run at some point, right? At some point, yes, soon as this fog clears. Until then, it wouldn't be safe. As you say, can hardly see past your own nose out there. I rest my head against the weathered counter. It feels neither warm nor cool. Bub, when was the last time the ferry ran? Can't say as I remember, now that you ask. What do you mean? You say you're the only ferryman, which you're not, but who else would know if not you? That's a fair question, but I can't recall the last trip I made across the water, or back for that matter. So if I can't get across with a ferry, not today, what with this fog, maybe tomorrow. Stop saying that. If the fog never goes away, the ferry never runs, and I never get out of here. Sounds mighty dramatic when you put it that way. Yes, it does, bub. And if you can't help, how the hell am I supposed to get to the other side? He pauses, thoughtfully gnawing the end of his pencil. Could catch the bus. Probably takes quite some time to go all the way around by land, but it'd get you there. Great. When's the next bus? Don't ask me, I'm just the ferryman. I take a deep breath to calm my urge to strangle Bub. Let me put it this way. Do you ever see the bus come through here? I'd say the bus hasn't been round for a while. Maybe years. Oh my God. So, there's no more bus service? Now that you ask, it sure seems that way. I sink down to the floor, on the verge of tears. Bub leans over the counter to look at me. Don't get too down, son. Maybe you could hitch a ride with an accommodating motorist. I hear some drivers enjoy the company and conversation. Keeps them alert on long drives. And the road from here to the other side must be long. So, you've made the drive? Oh no, not me. Can't leave this place. Someone needs to run the ferry. Of course. I pull myself up and lean against the window. Bub, how can I hitch when there hasn't been a single car on that road the whole time I've been here? Well, I'm not surprised folks are staying off the road, what with this fog and all. I give in and let laughter overtake me. When it subsides, I pick up my duffel bag. Fine, I'll walk it then. Oh, you don't want to do that, son. Like hell I don't. I need to get to the other side, or at least get out of this town before I lose what's left of my mind. Just slow down for a minute. Walking is not a good idea. The road is long, I get it, but I've got good shoes, and I can buy some food and water along the way. I'll be fine. Bub's eyes grow darker. No, you won't. I laugh again, but it doesn't feel funny. None of this does. Since you won't take me, walking seems to be my only option. Maybe out there a car will pick me up. All alone out there, on foot, you won't stand a chance. What are you talking about, old man? One way or another, I'm getting to the other side and you can't scare me off. I turn and yank the door handle too hard. The bell jangles wildly and I lurch out to the sidewalk. Standing there alone, I realize it has grown dim outside. How long was I in there talking to him? Along the road, there are no signs or other clues as to which way I should go. Visibility is no better than 10 feet in any direction. I am suddenly seized by a feeling there are eyes out there that watch me. Don't be stupid, I whisper. Bub's just in your head. This whole place is. But peering into the wall of grey that surrounds me, I become certain someone's watching, or rather something, ancient, hungry, waiting. When I walk back into the musty office, Bub looks up and smiles. Forget something? Actually, yeah, I say. This is kind of embarrassing, but you know what? I do have a valid ticket. He takes a long moment to size me up. Just as I'm about to admit my lie, he speaks. Why didn't you say so before? Sorry, Bought it a while ago, so it must have slipped my mind. I'm a little off today." "You're more than a little off, I'll give you that." He closes his puzzle book and comes out from behind the counter. "But since you've got a valid ticket, we can leave right away." "Wait, you're not just messing with me?" "I am not," says Bub. "So the fog's not a problem?" "Oh no, I've got all sorts of technology on board to help us get across in any conditions. You youngsters don't."